The richest woman in that courtroom looked me straight in the eye and said, "You work for me." I have heard disrespect before. I have watched people roll their eyes, slam folders, interrupt witnesses, and treat the law like a personal inconvenience. But there was something different in her voice that morning. She did not say it out of anger. She said it with certainty, as if the courtroom was another room in her mansion, as if justice was another service she had purchased. And 60 minutes later, that same woman was standing in front of me with mascara running down her face, begging the court not to reveal what was inside a sealed envelope. Before we go any further, make sure you have subscribed to this channel for more powerful courtroom stories like this one. And if you haven't subscribed yet, do it now. Also, comment below and tell us where you are watching this video from. Now let me take you back to where this case truly began. The case did not arrive in my courtroom looking extraordinary. On paper, it was a property damage claim. A wealthy woman named Victoria Langford was suing her former housekeeper, Grace Miller, for $8,000. Victoria claimed Grace had destroyed an antique crystal vase inside her estate while cleaning the formal dining room. Grace claimed she never touched the vase, never entered that room that day, and had been fired only after she refused to sign a paper admitting fault. That was the file. Cybele, clean, almost boring. But the moment Victoria Langford entered my courtroom, I knew the file was lying to me in the way files often do. Not because the words were false, but because the words were incomplete. Victoria walked in first. She was elegant in a way that looked designed for cameras. Cream designer suit, diamond earrings, perfectly polished nails, expensive perfume that reached my bench before she did. Her hair was styled with the kind of precision that makes a person look less prepared for court and more prepared for a magazine interview. She did not look nervous. She looked offended that she had been required to appear. Behind her came Grace Miller. Grace was 56 years old, wearing a simple navy dress and holding a worn leather purse with both hands. She moved carefully, not slowly, but carefully, the way working people move when they are used to being watched by people who can punish small mistakes. Her face carried exhaustion, but her eyes were steady. That interested me. Fear can shake a person. Truth can steady them. Grace had both when the bailiff called the case. Victoria did not wait for me to ask a question. She stepped forward, placed one manicured hand on the table, and said, "Your Honor, this should not take long. She broke something valuable. She lied about it, and I expect compensation." That was her first mistake. People who believe a case should not take long usually mean they do not want anyone looking too closely. I looked at Grace. She had not moved, not one word, not one interruption. She just stood there with her hands folded, listening to a wealthy woman reduce her entire reputation to a broken vase. I asked Victoria, "Do you have proof Miss Miller broke the item?" Victoria smiled, not warmly, politely, in the way people smile when they believe the question itself is beneath them. "She was my employee," she said. "The vase was intact before she worked that morning. It was shattered after she left. I don't know what more proof the court requires." That answer told me plenty. It told me she believed proximity was guilt. It told me she believed employment was ownership. And it told me she was used to people accepting her version of reality because challenging her cost too much. I asked Grace what happened. Her voice was quiet but clear. She said, "I cleaned the guest wing that morning, not the dining room. Mrs. Langford told me not to enter the dining room because she was having a private meeting." Victoria immediately turned toward her. That is not true. Grace did not look at her. She looked at me. That matters. Guilty people often watch the accuser to see which lie must be defended next. Truthful people often look toward the person who can finally hear them. Grace continued. She said she had worked for Victoria Langford for almost 7 years. She cleaned the home 3 days a week. She knew every hallway, every polished table, every fragile object Victoria displayed as though the house itself were a museum of superiority. And then Grace said something that made me pause. She said that vase had been cracked for months. Victoria's expression changed, only slightly, but I saw it, a tightening near the mouth, a hand lowering from the table as if she had touched something hot. I asked Grace to explain. Grace said the vase sat on a pedestal in the formal dining room near a large window. Months earlier, during a charity luncheon, one of Victoria's guests had bumped the pedestal. The vase did not fall, but Grace heard the crystal crack. She remembered because Victoria screamed at a young server until the girl cried. Victoria laughed under her breath. "Your Honor, this is absurd." She is inventing stories because she cannot pay. I looked at Victoria. There are moments in court when a single sentence reveals the soul of a case. Because she cannot pay. Not because she did not do it. Not because the facts are wrong. Because she cannot pay. To Victoria, Grace's financial situation was not background. It was leverage. I asked whether Victoria had photographs of the vase before the alleged damage. She opened a leather folder and removed several glossy images. They were beautiful, professionally taken photographs of the dining room from different angles. The vase stood tall near the window, catching the light. But something bothered me immediately. The photos were from a real estate listing, not from the day of the incident, not even from the same month. I asked, when were these taken? Victoria hesitated, then said, I believe last year. You believe? I own several properties, Your Honor. I don't personally track every photograph. That was when I noticed Grace's fingers tighten around her purse. Not fear this time, recognition. I asked Grace, do you have something to add? Grace swallowed and said, she has cameras in that house. Victoria's head snapped toward her. The room shifted. I looked back at Victoria. Do you? Victoria lifted her chin. For security, yes. Do the cameras show the dining room? No. Do they show the hallway outside it? She paused. This pause was longer. Yes, but the footage is automatically deleted. When? After a few days. When did the vase allegedly break? 3 weeks ago. I looked down at the file. Victoria had filed the claim only 4 days after firing Grace. Interesting. So when you filed this case, I said, the footage may still have existed. Victoria's eyes cooled. I'm not a technician, Your Honor. That answer was smooth. Too smooth. It was built to avoid a yes or no. And when people avoid simple answers, I do not move on. I move closer. I asked, did you review the footage? No. Did anyone in your household review it? No. Did you preserve it? No. Why not? Victoria's smile disappeared. Because I don't need video footage to know what happened in my own home. There it was again, ownership mistaken for truth. Then Grace spoke softly. She did look at it. The entire courtroom went still. Victoria turned toward Grace slowly. That was the first time I saw something behind her confidence that did not look polished. It looked dangerous. I asked Grace how she knew. Grace opened her purse and removed a folded piece of paper. Her hands trembled now, but she did not stop. She handed it to the bailiff, who brought it to me. It was a printed text message from Victoria Langford. It said, you should have signed the statement, Grace. I saw enough on the camera to make this very bad for you. I read it twice. Then I looked at Victoria. She looked back at me, but her face had changed again. No smile, no charm. Just calculation, I asked. You told this court you did not review the footage. Victoria said that message was taken out of context. I said, then put it in context. She opened her mouth. Nothing came out, and that was when she made the sentence that brought the entire room to a freeze. She leaned forward, pointed toward the bench, and said, I pay taxes in this county. You work for me. The gallery inhaled like one body. Grace looked down. The bailiff stepped forward slightly, and I sat there for one quiet second, studying Victoria Langford the way I have studied hundreds of people who believed money could become a weapon if held high enough. Then I said, "No, Mrs. Langford, I work for the law, and right now the law has a few questions for you." For the first time, Victoria did not look offended. She looked afraid, because what she did not know was that Grace Miller had not come to court with only a text message. She had brought one more piece of evidence, and once I saw it, I understood that broken vase was not the real reason Victoria wanted her silenced. Grace Miller's second piece of evidence was not dramatic when she first pulled it from her purse. It was not a video. It was not a photograph of the vase. It was not even something that looked important to anyone sitting in the gallery. It was a small yellow receipt, folded twice, with the corner softened from being carried around too long. But I have learned over the years that evidence does not have to look powerful to become powerful. Sometimes the smallest paper in the courtroom is the one that makes the richest person at the table stop breathing normally. Grace handed it to the bailiff. Victoria watched it travel to my bench like it was poison. I unfolded it. It was from a repair shop called Dawson Crystal Restoration. The date was nearly 5 months before the hearing. The customer name was Victoria Langford. The description read, "Antique crystal vase, visible structural crack near base, restoration estimate declined." I looked up slowly. Victoria's face had lost color. Not dramatically, not enough for the audience to gasp, but enough for me to see that the receipt had touched the part of the story she had hidden. I asked Grace, "Where did you get this?" Grace kept both hands on her purse. "I found it in the kitchen trash 2 days after Mrs. Langford fired me." Victoria snapped, "So now she admits she goes through my trash." Grace finally looked at her. "No. I emptied your trash because that was my job." That answer carried 7 years of swallowed humiliation inside it. I could hear it. The courtroom could hear it too. I turned the receipt over. On the back was a handwritten note. It said, "Too expensive. Find another way." Now I want you to understand why those 4 words mattered. A cracked vase is an accident. A repair estimate is ordinary. Declining an expensive restoration may be understandable. But "find another way," written on the back of a repair receipt, followed months later by an accusation against the housekeeper, followed by a text message threatening that same housekeeper with camera footage Victoria claimed not to review. That was no longer ordinary. That was a path, and cases are built on paths. I asked Victoria if the receipt was hers. She looked at me with the kind of offended expression wealthy people sometimes use when they believe outrage can replace an answer. "I don't remember every vendor I contact." "Did you contact Dawson Crystal Restoration?" "I may have." "Did you know the vase was cracked 5 months before this incident?" "It had a minor imperfection." "Minor enough that you requested a restoration estimate?" "It was an antique. Responsible owners maintain antiques. Responsible owners also tell the court when an item was already damaged." Her eyes narrowed. The mask was still on, but I could see the hands behind it beginning to shake. Grace stood silently, and I noticed she was not enjoying Victoria's discomfort. That mattered to me. A vindictive liar enjoys the other side getting trapped. Grace looked relieved but wounded. She was not trying to destroy Victoria. She was trying to survive her. I asked Grace how long the relationship between them had been tense. Grace looked down. "For about a year." Victoria laughed. "She was a housekeeper. There was no relationship." That sentence hit the room harder than she expected, because sometimes cruelty is revealed not in shouting, but in classification. She was a housekeeper, as if that meant Grace had no dignity, no memory, no right to be spoken of like a human being. I said, "Mrs. Langford, employment is a relationship." Victoria pressed her lips together. Grace explained that for the first several years, the work had been stable. Victoria was demanding but predictable. She wanted things arranged a certain way, towels folded a certain way, silver polished in the same direction, fresh flowers placed in the foyer before noon. Grace understood standards. She had cleaned homes for wealthy families for more than 25 years. She was not afraid of hard work, but after Victoria's husband, Richard Langford, passed away, something changed. The name Richard changed the air around Victoria. I saw it immediately. Her eyes shifted downward, then back up too quickly. People do that. When a name opens a room inside them, they do not want anyone entering. Grace said Richard had been different from Victoria. Quiet, polite. He tipped during holidays. He remembered her grandchildren's names. He once paid for her car repair when she could not get to work. Victoria stared straight ahead, no emotion. But the no emotion was itself an emotion. I asked when Richard died. Grace said, 9 months before I was fired. I asked whether the vase had belonged to Richard. Grace nodded. It was from his mother's family. Mrs. Langford hated it. Victoria cut in. I did not hate it. Grace did not flinch. You called it an ugly old thing. Victoria's jaw tightened. I asked Victoria whether that was true. She said, people say things. That was an answer I have heard from people who said exactly what they are accused of saying, Grace continued. She told me Richard had kept the vase in the dining room because it reminded him of his mother. After his death, Victoria began redecorating the house. She removed his books from the study, replaced the family portraits in the hall, and boxed up many of his personal belongings. That alone was not wrong. Grief looks different in every home. Some people preserve rooms like shrines. Others clear everything because memory becomes unbearable. A court should not judge a widow simply for changing a house after loss. But this case was not about redecorating. It was about blame. Grace said Victoria wanted the vase gone, but Richard's adult daughter, Caroline Hayes, wanted it preserved because it was part of her grandmother's estate. Caroline had apparently argued with Victoria over several inherited items, including the vase. At the mention of Caroline, Victoria's hand closed around her pen too tightly. I asked whether Caroline Hayes was present. The courtroom doors opened slightly. A woman in her early 30s stepped forward from the back row. I had noticed her earlier, sitting quietly with a folder in her lap. She had dark blonde hair, a black blazer, and the strained face of someone who had spent months being polite to someone she no longer trusted. She said, "I'm here, Your Honor." Victoria turned toward her. "What are you doing here?" Caroline did not answer her. She looked at me. That told me plenty. I asked Caroline how she was connected to the vase. She said it belonged to her grandmother and had been promised to her by her father. After Richard died, Victoria refused to release several family items, claiming she needed time to sort through the estate. Caroline said she tried to be patient, but Victoria kept delaying. Then Caroline said, "My father's will specifically listed the vase." Victoria stood straighter. "That will is being handled privately." I said, "Not if the vase is the subject of a claim in this court." Victoria's eyes flashed, and for a moment I saw the real case. It was not Grace versus Victoria. Grace was a shield Victoria had tried to break. The real conflict was between Victoria and the dead man's daughter. I asked Caroline why she had come. She opened her folder and said, "Because Grace called me after she was fired." She said Mrs. Langford was blaming her for the vase. But I already knew the vase was damaged. Victoria said, "Caroline is bitter because she didn't get everything she wanted." Caroline's voice remained controlled. "No, I'm here because my father trusted the wrong person." The room went silent. That was not a legal argument. That was a daughter's wound. And sometimes wounds tell you where to look. I asked Caroline what she had brought. She removed a copy of an email from her father, dated at about a month before he died. In it, Richard wrote that the vase had developed a crack after a luncheon and that Victoria wanted it removed from the dining room, but he wanted it restored and eventually given to Caroline. I read the email carefully. Then I looked at Victoria. Your husband knew the vase was cracked. Victoria said nothing. His daughter knew the vase was cracked. Nothing. The restoration shop knew the vase was cracked. Still nothing. And Grace Miller, your housekeeper, knew the vase was cracked. Victoria's face hardened. She broke it completely. There it was, the fallback position. When the first lie fails, the second lie adjusts. Not it was never cracked. Now it was yes, it was cracked, but Grace finished it. That is how dishonest people move through evidence. They do not surrender the story. They reshape it around whatever facts survive. I asked, where are the pieces of the vase now? Victoria paused. At my home. Have you brought them? No. Why not? I did not think I needed to bring broken glass to court. I looked at her. You brought photographs from last year, but not the actual object you claim was destroyed by Ms. Miller. She said nothing. Then Grace spoke. She doesn't have the pieces. Victoria turned sharply. Grace's voice grew quieter. She threw them away before she filed the claim. That was when Caroline's face changed. I watched her carefully. Her grief moved into shock first, then anger, then a kind of cold understanding. Victoria whispered, "You have no idea what you're talking about." But she did not say it loudly. She said it like a person who had just heard a locked door opening somewhere behind her. I asked Grace how she knew. Grace swallowed. Because she told me to carry the box to the outside bin. When? The day after she fired me, after she accused you. Grace nodded. She said, if I wanted my final check, I would help clean up my mess. That sentence disturbed me, not just because of the accusation, but because of the structure of control inside it. Final check, clean up my mess. She had tied Grace's wages to an admission. She had used money like a leash. I looked at Victoria Langford, and for the first time, the woman who told me I worked for her seemed to understand she had spoken too soon, because Caroline Hayes had just opened her folder again. And this time, she pulled out something that made Victoria whisper one word under her breath: don't. Caroline Hayes held the document with both hands, and I remember the way Victoria Langford's face changed before anyone even saw what it was. That is something I have learned after years on the bench. Sometimes the evidence does not need to be read first. Sometimes the guilty reaction introduces it. Victoria whispered, don't, not loudly, not dramatically. Just one sharp, frightened word that slipped out before her pride could stop it. The entire courtroom heard it. Caroline heard it too. She looked at Victoria for the first time, and there was no hatred in her expression. Hatred is hot. What I saw on Caroline's face was colder than that. It was the look of a daughter who had finally stopped hoping the woman her father married would do the decent thing. I asked Caroline, "What are you holding?" She took a breath. "It's a copy of my father's inventory list." Victoria immediately said, "That is not relevant." I looked at her. "Mrs. Langford, every time you tell me something is not relevant, it becomes more interesting." She lowered her eyes. Caroline handed the paper to the bailiff. When it reached my bench, I studied it carefully. It was a typed estate inventory attachment, signed by Richard Langford and witnessed by his attorney. Several family items were listed with notes beside them. A grandfather clock, a set of silver candlesticks, a collection of letters, and there it was. Mother's crystal vase to Caroline Hayes after my passing. Below that line in handwriting was a note, Victoria Objects, says it ruins the dining room. I looked at Victoria, her jaw was tight. Grace stared down at the floor as if she already knew what that line meant. Caroline's voice trembled when she spoke again. "My father told me she wanted it gone before he died. He told me not to argue because he was tired, but he promised me it was mine. I have seen inheritance disputes turn decent people cruel. Grief and property are a dangerous mixture. But this case had something darker inside it. Victoria had not simply wanted an object removed. She had accused a working woman of destroying it, threatened her wages, dragged her into court, and demanded money from someone who could not afford to lose even one paycheck. That is when wealth becomes dangerous. Not when a person has it, when a person believes it gives them permission. I asked Victoria why she sued Grace if the vase had already been promised to Caroline. Victoria straightened her shoulders. Because Grace broke it. But if Grace broke it, why did you not notify Caroline immediately? She is not entitled to every conversation in my home. It was her property under the inventory. That has not been finalized. Was your claim for $8,000 based on the value of a vase you believed belonged to you? Victoria hesitated, and there it was again. That pause. A pause is not always guilt. People pause to remember, to breathe, to understand a question. But Victoria's pauses were different. They arrived right before her story had to change direction. She said, I was responsible for the home. That is not what I asked. I was managing the estate. That is still not what I asked. Her face reddened. I believed I had standing. That was a lawyer-like phrase from a woman who had spent the morning pretending this case was simple. I asked, who told you to say that? Victoria looked offended. No one. Grace quietly said, her attorney. Victoria turned on her. Stop speaking as if you know my life. Grace flinched, and I saw the old pattern return for 1 second. Victoria's voice had a way of making people smaller. She did not need to shout. She used precision. She used status. She used the kind of tone that tells a person they should be grateful just to be tolerated. But Grace did not disappear this time. She raised her eyes and said, I know what you told me to sign. That got my attention. I asked, what statement? Grace opened her purse again and removed another folded paper. Victoria closed her eyes. For half a second, she looked exhausted by the evidence itself, as if the truth had become rude by continuing to exist. The bailiff brought me the paper. It was a typed statement. At the top, it had Grace Miller's name. Below it was a paragraph admitting that Grace had entered the dining room, accidentally knocked over the crystal vase, and agreed to repay Victoria Langford through deductions from her final wages and future payment installments. At the bottom was a blank signature line. Grace had not signed it. I asked Grace who prepared the statement. She did, Victoria said. I gave her an opportunity to take responsibility privately. No, Grace said, her voice firmer now. You gave me a choice between lying and losing my job. The room went silent. That is the thing about simple sentences in court. When they are true, they do not need decoration. I asked Victoria whether she drafted the statement. She said, I had someone help me put it into proper language. Who, my assistant? Name? Victoria looked down. Lydia Brooks. Is Lydia Brooks here? No answer. I looked toward the gallery. No one moved. I asked again, is your assistant here? Victoria said no. Did she witness Grace break the vase? No. Did anyone witness Grace break the vase? Victoria's eyes lifted toward me slowly. No. There it was. The first clean answer she had given all morning, and it damaged her more than all the evasions before it. No witness, no footage produced. No damaged vase brought to court. A prior crack documented. An estate inventory showing the item was promised to someone else. A prepared admission form, a text message threatening Grace. And a wealthy plaintiff who believed the judge worked for her. I turned to Grace. Why didn't you sign it? Her mouth trembled. Because my name is all I have. I will never forget that answer. Not money, not property, not influence. Her name, Grace Miller, had spent decades cleaning other people's homes. She had polished their furniture, folded their sheets, emptied their trash, carried their broken things. heard their arguments through walls, and walked quietly through rooms where people barely saw her. But she still had her name, her reputation, her dignity, and Victoria wanted that too. I asked Grace what happened after she refused. Grace said Victoria became very calm. That word mattered. Not angry, calm. She told Grace that people like her should think carefully before making enemies of people like Victoria. Then she withheld Grace's final paycheck and told other families in the neighborhood that Grace was careless, dishonest, and possibly unstable. Again, that word, unstable. It appears so often in cases where powerful people want to make truthful people look dangerous spoke. I heard that too. I turned to her. She said two of her father's friends told her Victoria had called Grace emotionally erratic and suggested she had been stealing small items from the house for years. Grace's face collapsed. I never stole anything. I believed her before she said it, not because judges rely on emotion, but because patterns matter. Victoria did not just accuse. She surrounded her accusations with damage. If Grace would not sign the paper, Victoria would make sure others doubted her before she could defend herself. That is not justice. That is strategy. I asked Victoria whether she had accused Grace of theft to others. Victoria said, I may have expressed concerns. With evidence, I had concerns. That is not evidence. She had access. Access is not evidence. She needed money. The moment she said it, I saw Grace close her eyes, and that made me angry in the way judges are not supposed to show, so I did what discipline requires. I became quieter. Mrs. Langford, I said, needing money does not make a person a thief. Victoria swallowed. For the first time, she had no immediate answer. Then Caroline opened her folder one more time. This time, she removed a small sealed envelope. It was cream-colored, expensive, and marked with Richard Langford's name in blue ink. Victoria looked at it and froze. I noticed something then that shifted the entire case in my mind. Victoria was not afraid of Grace's receipt. She was not afraid of the unsigned statement. She was not even afraid of Caroline's inventory list. She was afraid of that envelope. Caroline said, my father gave this to me before his last surgery. He told me not to open it unless Victoria tried to keep or destroy the family items. Victoria's voice cracked. Caroline, don't do this. That was the first time she used his name like a plea instead of an accusation. Caroline did not look at her. She looked at me. Your Honor, I didn't want to bring this into court, but after what she did to Grace, I think you need to see it. I looked at the envelope, then at Victoria. The woman who had told me I worked for her was no longer looking at me like an employee. She was looking at me like a locked door she could not buy her way through. And when Caroline broke the seal, Victoria Langford whispered something so strange, so revealing, that even Grace turned to stare at her. She said, he promised he wouldn't tell anyone. He promised he wouldn't tell anyone. Those words did not sound like anger. They sounded like fear. And fear, when it appears suddenly in a courtroom, often points directly toward the door someone has been trying to keep closed. I looked at Victoria Langford carefully. Her face had gone pale beneath the makeup. Her posture was still upright, still trained, still expensive, but something inside her had shifted. The woman who entered my courtroom believing authority could be purchased was now staring at a sealed envelope as though a dead man had just walked back into the room. Caroline Hayes held the opened envelope in both hands. Grace Miller stood beside her table, quiet, confused, and visibly afraid of what might be coming next. That was one of the most painful parts of this case. Grace had entered my courtroom to defend herself from a false accusation, but every new document revealed that she had been dragged into a much deeper family war. I asked Caroline, what is inside the envelope? She removed 2 folded pages. The paper was not official court paper. It was personal stationery, thick and cream-colored, The kind a man like Richard Langford might have kept in a desk drawer for private correspondence. Caroline unfolded it slowly, and I could see her hands beginning to tremble. Victoria whispered, "Caroline, please." That please told me more than her denials had. I said, "Mrs. Langford, you will remain silent." She looked at me, and for the first time I did not see arrogance. I saw panic trying to wear arrogance's clothes. Caroline began to read. The letter was from her father. Richard wrote that if Caroline was reading it, then Victoria had likely refused to release certain family property after his death. He wrote that he had grown concerned during the final year of his life because several heirlooms had disappeared from storage, then later reappeared only when he asked direct questions. Caroline's voice cracked. But she continued. Richard wrote that Victoria had developed what he called an appetite for control disguised as taste. He said she treated his family history like clutter. He said she wanted the Langford home to reflect only her image, not his past. Victoria closed her eyes. I watched Grace. She looked stunned, but not surprised. That distinction mattered. Some truths shock people. Other truths confirm what they quietly feared. Caroline read the next paragraph. Richard had discovered that Victoria tried to have the crystal vase appraised without telling him. Not repaired, appraised. He believed she intended to sell it before his death, but changed course when she learned it had less resale value because of the crack near the base. That was when the courtroom leaned in. Because now the repair receipt had a different meaning. It was not simply proof that the vase was damaged. It was proof that Victoria had already been looking for a way to turn that vase into money or remove it from the estate. I asked Caroline to stop reading for a moment. Then I turned to Victoria. Did you have the vase appraised before your husband died? Victoria's eyes opened. She took a breath. I handled many household matters. That is not an answer. It was my home. It was his family property. She looked at Caroline with resentment returning to her face. His family never accepted me. Caroline said softly, "My father accepted you." Victoria snapped. "Your father was weak when it came to guilt." The moment she said it, the courtroom felt the cruelty of it. A dead husband reduced to weakness, a daughter forced to hear it. A housekeeper standing in the middle of a grief she had never caused. I said, "Mrs. Langford, you are helping me understand this case, but not in the way you think." She turned back toward me, furious, and then stopped herself. That mattered too. She was learning that every impulse betrayed her. I asked Caroline to continue. The next section of Richard's letter described a conversation he had with Victoria about Grace. He wrote that Grace had been loyal, discreet, and honest. He wrote that if anything happened after his death involving accusations against staff, Caroline should look closely before believing them. Grace's eyes filled with tears. She had not expected the dead man to defend her. That is one of the strange mercies of courtrooms. Sometimes the truth arrives late, but it still arrives with a voice. Caroline read one final line before she had to pause. "If Victoria cannot get rid of what belongs to my family, she may try to blame someone who cannot afford to fight her." That sentence landed like a gavel. I looked at Victoria. She was staring at the floor now, not crying, not yet, but breathing differently. I asked whether Richard's attorney had a copy of this letter. Caroline said yes, and that she had contacted him after Grace called her. The attorney had also provided the inventory list. That explained why the documents were organized. That explained why Caroline had not come empty-handed. She had not come simply as an angry stepdaughter. She had come because her father had warned her. I asked Grace what happened on the day she was fired. Grace took a moment before answering. She said she arrived at the Langford home at 8:15 in the morning. Victoria was already dressed, standing near the staircase, speaking on the phone. Grace heard Victoria say, I don't care what Caroline thinks. It will be gone before she gets here. Victoria looked up sharply. Grace continued. She said Victoria ended the call when she saw her and instructed her to clean the guest wing only. Grace worked upstairs for nearly 2 hours. Around 10:30, she heard glass break downstairs. Not a small sound, a heavy crashing sound. Grace froze. Then she heard Victoria shout her name. When Grace came down, the dining room floor was covered in broken crystal. Victoria was standing near the pedestal. The vase was shattered. But Grace said something else was strange. Victoria was wearing shoes. That may sound small to you, but in a housekeeper's memory, small things become records. Grace explained that Victoria had a strict rule. No hard-soled shoes in the formal dining room because of the polished hardwood. Staff had to wear soft shoes or shoe covers. Guests were reminded constantly. That morning, Victoria was standing near broken crystal in pointed heels. I asked Victoria if she had been in the dining room before the vase broke. She said, I walked through. Before or after? I don't remember. You remember Grace broke it, but you do not remember whether you were in the room before or after the crash. Her lips tightened. I was upset. I said, that is becoming a very convenient condition. Grace then said Victoria immediately told her to pick up the pieces. Grace refused at first because there was broken crystal everywhere and she did not have gloves. Victoria screamed at her to clean it anyway. Grace swept the large pieces into a box. Later, Victoria told her she would not be paid unless she signed the statement. I asked, did you see the vase fall? Grace said, no. Did Victoria see you break it? Grace shook her head. She said, nobody would believe me. That sentence brought me back to the beginning. You work for me. There are people who do not merely lie. They build a world where their lie feels inevitable because everyone around them has something to lose. Grace had wages to lose. Daniel-like witnesses in other cases have jobs to lose. Caroline had family property to lose, and Victoria had learned to move through those fears like hallways in her own home. I asked Caroline whether she came to the house after the vase broke. She nodded. 2 days later, Victoria told me Grace had destroyed it and that there was nothing left to discuss. Did you ask to see the pieces? Yes. What did she say? Caroline looked at Victoria. She said they were already thrown away because she could not bear to look at them. Victoria said, that was true. But her voice lacked conviction. Caroline then removed one more document from her folder, a photograph. The bailiff brought it to me. It showed an outside trash area beside the Langford estate. A large black disposal bin was open. Inside was a cardboard box filled with broken crystal pieces. The photo was time-stamped the day after the alleged incident. I asked Caroline who took it. She said, Grace sent it to me. Grace looked embarrassed. I thought someone should know. That photograph mattered. Not because it proved who broke the vase, but because it proved Victoria had disposed of the evidence almost immediately, even though she intended to sue Grace for the damage. People seeking justice preserve evidence. People shaping a story destroy what might contradict them. I asked Victoria, why did you throw away the pieces? She said, they were dangerous. You live in a house large enough to store them safely. No answer. You filed a claim for $8,000. Still no answer. You wanted money for an object you chose not to produce. She lifted her chin again. I was advised that photographs would be sufficient. By whom? My attorney. Is that the same attorney who told you to say you had standing? Her eyes sharpened. I am not on trial. I leaned forward. No, Mrs. Langford. But your credibility is. That was the moment the room changed again, because Victoria Langford could tolerate being accused by Grace. She could tolerate Caroline's grief. She could even tolerate documents written by a dead husband, but she could not tolerate losing control of how she appeared. I saw it building in her face, the anger. the humiliation, the need to strike back. And then she made another mistake. She pointed toward Grace and said, "Ask her why she really needed money." Grace went still. Caroline turned slowly. Victoria continued, voice low but poisonous. "Ask her about her grandson. Ask her about the medical bills. Ask her how desperate she was." Grace's eyes filled with shock, not guilt, shock. And the room understood it at once. Victoria had just done exactly what Richard's letter warned she would do. She had taken private pain and tried to turn it into suspicion. I asked Grace if she had a grandson with medical bills. Grace nodded, crying now. "Yes, Your Honor. He has a heart condition." Victoria said, "So she had motive." I felt the courtroom tense. I spoke very quietly. "Mrs. Langford, poverty is not motive. Medical debt is not motive. Loving a sick child is not motive. But using that information to frame a woman in open court tells me a great deal about yours." Victoria's face went red. For once she had no polished answer. Then Caroline stood a little straighter and said, "Your Honor, there is still one thing you have not seen." I looked at her. She reached into the folder and removed a small black flash drive. Victoria's face changed completely. The arrogance vanished. The color drained. The controlled widow, the wealthy homeowner, the woman who believed courts were funded by her personal importance, suddenly looked like someone standing on the edge of a cliff. Caroline said, "My father's attorney requested a copy of the home camera backups before they were deleted." Victoria whispered, "That's impossible." Caroline looked at her and said, "No, that's what Dad told him to do." And that was when I realized the dead man had not only warned his daughter, he had set a trap. The flash drive was placed on the evidence table. The screen at the front of the courtroom flickered on. Grace gripped the edge of her table. Caroline did not blink. Victoria sat perfectly still. And before the footage even started playing, I saw tears forming in Victoria Langford's eyes, not because she was sorry, because she already knew what we were about to see. The flash drive was small enough to disappear inside a closed fist, but in that courtroom, it carried more weight than every diamond on Victoria Langford's hands. I watched the bailiff connect it to the evidence screen, and I remember the silence that followed. It was not ordinary silence. It was the kind of silence that appears when everyone understands something irreversible is about to happen. Grace Miller stood at her table, gripping the edge so tightly her knuckles had turned pale. Caroline Hayes did not sit down. She kept her eyes fixed on the screen, her face tight with the pain of a daughter who was about to see one final message from her father's world. Victoria Langford looked straight ahead, but she was no longer performing confidence. She was bracing for impact. The video opened with a hallway camera inside the Langford estate. The timestamp showed the morning of the alleged incident, 8:27 a.m. Grace appeared first. She entered through the service door wearing her work clothes, carrying cleaning supplies in a plastic caddy. She paused near the side table, checked a paper list, then walked upstairs toward the guest wing exactly as she had testified. No dining room, no vase, no secret movement through the house. Just a working woman beginning another day in a home that would soon try to swallow her reputation. I glanced at Victoria. She did not move. The footage continued. 9:04 a.m. Victoria appeared at the bottom of the staircase, holding her phone. She was speaking sharply, though there was no audio. She paced near the dining room entrance, then looked up toward the upstairs hallway where Grace had gone. The next camera angle showed the formal dining room, and that was when the courtroom leaned forward as one body. The vase was there. Standing on its pedestal near the window, even through the camera, the crack near its base was visible when the light hit it. A thin line running through the crystal, like a secret the house had been keeping too long. Victoria entered the dining room alone. She was wearing pointed heels. Grace was nowhere near her. No one was. Victoria stood in front of the vase for several seconds. She looked toward the doorway, then toward the ceiling corner where the camera was positioned. At that moment, I saw her make a mistake that guilty people often make. She looked for the camera she knew about, but she did not know about the backup angle. The footage we were watching came from a secondary camera installed after a prior burglary scare. Richard's attorney had preserved it through the security company. Victoria had apparently believed the main hallway footage was all that mattered, but the room camera saw everything. Victoria took the vase in both hands. The courtroom stopped breathing. Grace whispered, "Oh my God." Victoria lifted the vase from the pedestal. For a moment she held it against her chest, and I wondered whether some part of her might still hesitate, whether Richard's memory, Caroline's inheritance, or simple decency might reach her before she crossed the line. It did not. She lowered the vase to the edge of the pedestal. Then she pushed it, not accidentally, not in surprise, not while stumbling. She pushed it with 2 fingers. The vase fell. The crystal struck the hardwood floor and exploded into pieces. Even without sound, every person in that courtroom seemed to hear it. Grace began to cry. Caroline covered her mouth. Victoria closed her eyes. And I sat there watching a wealthy woman's entire claim shatter on a screen exactly the way the vase had shattered on the floor. But the footage was not finished. Victoria stepped back from the broken crystal and stared at it. Then she looked up toward the stairs and shouted something. A few seconds later, Grace appeared at the dining room doorway. Her body language told the truth before her mouth ever could have. She stopped suddenly, her shoulders pulled back, one hand lifted in confusion. Victoria pointed at the floor, then pointed at Grace. The accusation had begun before Grace even understood what she was being accused of. The courtroom murmured. I raised one hand, and the room quieted. The video continued. Grace shook her head repeatedly. Victoria stepped closer. Her gestures became sharper. She pointed at the broken vase again, then at Grace's chest, then toward the kitchen. Grace backed away. Victoria followed. That was not a homeowner confronting damage. That was a person forcing a story into existence. The footage changed again. Now we saw the kitchen. Victoria placed a sheet of paper on the counter. Grace stood across from her, shaking her head. Victoria pushed the paper toward her. Grace refused. Victoria leaned forward and said something with such force that Grace looked down at the floor. I did not need audio to understand the power in that moment. A wealthy employer, a working woman, a false statement. A paycheck being held hostage. That was the real case. Not a vase, not $8,000. A woman with power trying to purchase another woman's confession with fear. Then came the moment that made the courtroom erupt. Victoria picked up her phone and typed. Seconds later, Grace looked down at her own phone. Caroline whispered, the text. I had the message in front of me. You should have signed the statement, Grace. I saw enough on the camera to make this very bad for you. Now, we knew what that meant. Victoria had not seen Grace break the vase. She had seen herself break it. And she used the existence of cameras to threaten Grace because she believed no one else would ever see the footage. That is arrogance at its most dangerous, not simply believing you can lie. Believing the truth itself can be locked away if you own enough doors. I paused the video. I looked at Victoria. Her tears had started now. They slipped down her face silently at first, gathering along her jawline, ruining the careful perfection she had brought into my courtroom. But I saw terror. Terror of exposure. Terror of Caroline. Terror of the room. Terror of consequences she had spent a lifetime believing were for other people. I asked Mrs. Langford, did you push that vase? She covered her mouth. I repeated, did you push that vase? She whispered. I was upset. That answer spread through the courtroom like smoke. Not, it was an accident. I was upset. I asked, "Did Grace Miller break it?" Victoria shook her head. Grace sobbed once, then pressed both hands against her mouth as if she were trying to keep herself standing. I asked, "Did you prepare a false statement for her to sign?" Victoria's shoulders shook. I didn't think she would fight it. That sentence was the heart of the case. She did not think Grace would fight it. Not because Grace was guilty, because Grace was poor, because Grace needed wages, because Grace had a sick grandson, because Grace cleaned houses for women like Victoria and had been trained by life to survive humiliation quietly. I said, "Answer the question." Victoria whispered, "Yes." Caroline lowered her head. I asked, "Did you sue her for money after knowing she did not break the vase?" Victoria began crying harder. "I just wanted it over." "No," I said. "You wanted it paid for by someone else." She looked up at me then, and for a moment the old entitlement flashed through the tears. "You don't understand what that house became after Richard died." The courtroom went still, and then the confession came, not cleanly, not nobly, but the way ugly truth often comes out when every elegant lie has failed. Victoria said Richard's family treated her like a temporary guest in her own marriage. She said Caroline always looked at her as if she were stealing something. She said every object in that house had his mother's name, his first wife's memory, his daughter's claim, his family's history. She said she was tired of living in a museum of people who never loved her. Caroline's face broke. "My father loved you," she said. Victoria turned on her with tears in her eyes. "He loved his guilt more." That sentence cut the room open. There are moments when a person says something so cruel that even their own pain cannot excuse it. Victoria had not broken the vase because it was damaged. She had broken it because it represented a family she could not control, a dead husband she resented, and a daughter she wanted to wound, and Grace Miller had simply been convenient, a name she could sacrifice. A person she assumed the court would not believe. I asked Victoria why she threw away the pieces. She said nothing, Caroline answered softly, because the crack showed it was already damaged. Victoria did not deny it. I asked why she claimed $8,000. Victoria wiped her face. Because that was the appraisal before the crack. The gallery reacted again. There it was, the final layer. She did not merely blame Grace for damage Grace did not cause. She claimed the value of an undamaged vase while knowing the item had already lost value months earlier. That was not confusion, that was fraud. I looked at Grace, and I saw something I rarely see at the exact truth wins. She did not look victorious. She looked devastated. Because clearing your name does not erase the weeks you spent thinking it might be destroyed. It does not return the sleep you lost, the jobs that stopped calling, the shame of being treated like a thief when you knew you were innocent. Grace said, barely above a whisper, "You told people I stole from you." Victoria looked at her. For 1 second, I thought she might apologize. Instead, she said, "You were never supposed to see any of this." The courtroom went completely silent. That was the viral moment. Not the vase breaking, not the video, not even the admission. It was that sentence. You were never supposed to see any of this, because inside those words was the entire truth of Victoria Langford's world. The truth could exist. The truth could be recorded. The truth could sit on a server, inside an envelope, in a dead man's instructions. But people like Grace were never supposed to see it. People like Grace were supposed to apologize, sign, pay, disappear, and remain grateful they were not destroyed further. I leaned back in my chair and looked at Victoria for a long moment. Then I said, "Mrs. Langford, the problem is not that we saw it. The problem is that you did it." Victoria's face collapsed. She cried openly now. Caroline turned away from her. Grace stood trembling, but taller than before. And I knew then that part of my ruling would have to do more than dismiss a claim. It would have to answer a question far older than this case. What happens when someone with power uses the court as a weapon against someone they think cannot fight back? I looked down at the file Victoria had brought into my courtroom, $8,000. That was what she wanted from Grace. But by the time the footage ended, it was clear Victoria Langford had walked into court demanding payment, and instead she had brought evidence of her own destruction. I looked at Victoria Langford, and for the first time that morning, she looked smaller than the woman who had entered my courtroom. Not humble, not redeemed, just smaller. There is a difference. Humility comes when a person recognizes the harm they caused. Exposure comes when a person realizes the room finally recognizes it too. Victoria was not standing in humility yet. She was standing in exposure. And exposure is cold. Grace Miller was still crying, but quietly now. Her tears were not dramatic. They were tired. The kind of tears a person cries when their body has been holding itself together for too long and finally receives permission to loosen its grip. Caroline Hayes stood beside her table with her father's letter pressed against her chest. She had come to court to protect a family heirloom, but what she discovered was worse than the broken vase. She discovered that her father had been right to worry. She discovered that the woman who smiled through inheritance conversations had been willing to destroy both property and people to control the story after his death. I have said this many times from the bench, and I meant it that day more than ever. The courtroom is not a weapon for the powerful. It is supposed to be the place where power is tested by truth. Victoria had tried to reverse that. She had tried to use the court as an extension of her home. She walked in believing Grace would be frightened, Caroline would be dismissed as bitter, and I would see a wealthy homeowner on one side and a housekeeper on the other. She miscalculated badly. I dismissed Victoria Langford's claim in full, not $1, not 1 cent. Then I turned to Grace Miller's counterclaim. Grace had requested unpaid wages, compensation for withheld final pay, costs connected to defending herself, and damages allowed for the harm caused by Victoria's false accusation. I awarded everything supported by the evidence. I also ordered Victoria to provide written correction notices to the families and agencies she had contacted with accusations against Grace. That mattered. Money could help Grace survive. But reputation was what Victoria had tried to kill. A person's name is not a small thing, especially when that person earns a living inside other people's homes. Trust is her currency. Trust is what opens doors, creates work, feeds grandchildren, pays rent, buys medicine, and allows a working woman to keep standing in a world that already asks too much from her. Victoria had tried to poison that trust. So I made the ruling clear. I said, Mrs. Langford, you will not destroy a woman's reputation in private and then hide behind silence in public. Victoria looked down. Her tears had slowed. I continued. You accused Grace Miller of breaking an item you destroyed yourself. You attempted to force her into signing a false admission. You withheld wages. You threatened her with footage you believed would never be seen. You filed a claim in this court knowing your version of events was false. The courtroom was completely still. Even the people waiting for other cases had stopped moving. I said, this court is referring this matter for review of possible perjury, attempted fraud, and any other action the appropriate authorities believe applies. Victoria's face changed again. Now the fear returned. She looked at me and whispered, please, Your Honor. There it was. The same woman who told me I worked for her was now asking for mercy from the institution she had insulted. But mercy is not the same as pretending. I told her mercy belongs to people who tell the truth before the evidence corners them. She covered her face. Grace looked away. That showed me who Grace was. Even after everything, she did not want to watch another person collapse. That kind of decency cannot be purchased. It has to be carried. Then Caroline asked if she could speak. I allowed it. She turned toward Victoria, not with rage, but with a sadness that seemed older than the case itself. "My father left you a home," Caroline said. "He left you money. He left you dignity. You chose to fight over pieces of him because you couldn't own the parts of him that loved us, too." Victoria did not answer. Caroline's voice broke, but she kept going. "That vase was my grandmother's. But Grace was never part of our family fight. You used her because you thought no one would believe her." Grace began crying again. Caroline turned toward her and said, "I believe you." Those 3 words did something the ruling itself could not do. Grace closed her eyes, and for a moment I watched the weight of weeks lift from her face. Not completely. Damage like that does not vanish in one sentence. But truth had finally been spoken directly to the person who deserved to hear it. "I believe you." Sometimes justice sounds like a gavel. Sometimes it sounds like that. The vase, of course, could not be restored in the way Caroline wanted. The pieces were gone, discarded, because Victoria thought broken evidence would stay buried. But Richard's letter remained. The inventory remained. The footage remained. And more importantly, the truth remained. That is something people like Victoria forget. You can break an object. You can throw away the pieces. You can threaten the person you blamed. You can walk into court dressed in wealth and confidence and say, "You work for me." But you cannot always control what survives. A text survives, a receipt survives, a daughter's folder survives, a dead man's warning survives, a housekeeper's dignity survives, and sometimes the truth survives on a camera angle you did not know existed. When the hearing ended, Grace did not celebrate. She gathered her purse with both hands, the same way she had entered, but she stood differently now. Her shoulders were not as tight. Her eyes were still wet. But they no longer searched the room for permission to exist. Caroline walked beside her. Victoria stayed at her table for several seconds after everyone else began to move. She stared at the empty space in front of her, and I wondered whether she was thinking about the vase, the money, Richard, or only the consequences waiting outside the courtroom. I cannot know. Judges see outcomes, not souls. But I know what I saw that morning. I saw a rich woman mistake money for authority. I saw her mistake employment for ownership. I saw her mistake fear for guilt. And I saw a quiet working woman stand in the truth while a mansion full of lies collapsed around her. People often think courtroom justice is about dramatic confessions, shocking evidence, or a final sentence that makes everyone gasp. Sometimes it is, but more often justice is slower. It is a receipt unfolded carefully, a text message read twice, a witness finding courage, a daughter opening an envelope her father hoped she would never need. Justice is not always loud, but when it finally speaks, everyone hears it, and that is why this case stayed with me. Not because Victoria Langford insulted me. I have been insulted before. Not because she cried. I have seen tears from guilty people and innocent people alike. It stayed with me because of the arrogance behind her words. "You work for me." That sentence revealed everything. It revealed how she saw the court, how she saw Grace, how she saw the law, how she saw anyone without her money, her address, her last name, or her social circle. But the law does not belong to the richest person in the room. The truth does not become weaker because it comes from a housekeeper, and dignity does not disappear because someone powerful refuses to recognize it. Before Grace left, she turned back toward the bench and said, "Thank you, Your Honor." I nodded, but I remember thinking she was not thanking me only for the ruling. She was thanking the room for finally listening. And after years on the bench, I can tell you that being heard is sometimes the first piece of justice a person receives. Victoria Langford walked into my courtroom believing the system worked for her. She left knowing it did not. It worked for the evidence, it worked for the truth, and on that day, it worked for Grace Miller.